Richard sat on the old wooden bench at the far corner of the park, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his face carrying the kind of tiredness money could never fix. The morning sun was warm, and the sound of children playing nearby filled the air with laughter, but for him, the joy around seemed like a world far away. He had built a company from nothing, turned it into a giant, and earned a fortune people could only dream of. Yet, at that moment, all he could feel was emptiness. For years, Richard had been called a genius in business, a sharp leader, and sometimes even ruthless in boardrooms. Reporters wrote about his lifestyle, his cars, his houses, and his name was always on the list of the most powerful men in the city. But no one wrote about the nights he sat alone in his mansion, no one mentioned the way silence echoed in the big halls when he came home, and no one knew that behind his confident smile, he carried a loneliness he could not shake off. On that day, he had walked into the park without a clear reason. He just wanted to be away from meetings, away from his office walls, and away from the endless noise of success. He thought maybe sitting on a bench and watching the world go by might calm his heart, even if only for a few minutes. He leaned back, staring at the children chasing each other, their mothers calling them back, their fathers lifting them up in the air. Richard wondered quietly if he had missed something in life by giving all his time to work. As he sat there, lost in thought, he didn't notice a little girl standing a few feet away, staring at him curiously. She was about 6 years old, her hair tied up in 2 playful ponytails, wearing a simple yellow dress that matched the brightness of her smile. Unlike others who passed by without paying attention to the lonely man in a suit, she noticed the sadness in his eyes. Children, with their pure hearts, often see what adults ignore. She tilted her head and walked closer. Richard, still deep in thought, only realized she was there when he heard a small, innocent voice. "You look sad, mister, wanna meet my mommy?" For a moment, Richard blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. He turned and looked at the child, who was now standing in front of him, her little hands folded behind her back. She repeated herself with the same softness but with even more curiosity, as if she was truly concerned about him. He almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the most unexpected thing anyone had said to him in months. In boardrooms, people asked him about profits, strategies, and deals. At social gatherings, they talked about investments or his expensive watch. But no one had asked him if he was sad. No one had looked at him as simply a man, not a millionaire, not a CEO. "You think I look sad?" Richard asked gently, his voice low, not wanting to scare her away. The girl nodded with all seriousness, her eyes wide. "Yes. You don't smile like the other people here. Mommy says when someone looks sad, they might need a friend." Something inside Richard softened. He wasn't used to this kind of honesty. Most adults either ignored his emotions or pretended he was too strong to have them. But here was a child, speaking without fear, offering something so simple yet so rare: kindness. "What's your name?" he asked, leaning slightly forward. "Emily," she said proudly. "And my mommy is over there." She pointed toward a woman sitting under a tree, reading a book while occasionally looking up to check on her daughter. The woman looked ordinary compared to the glamorous people Richard usually saw at high-class events. She wore a plain dress, her hair tied neatly, and her focus seemed calm. Richard smiled faintly. "You want me to meet your mommy?" Emily grinned. "Yes. She likes helping people. And maybe she can help you smile too." Her innocence made Richard pause. He wondered what kind of woman raised a daughter so full of warmth. Part of him wanted to refuse politely and go back to his thoughts, but another part, the tired and lonely part, whispered that maybe he should say yes. What harm could there be in meeting a stranger who offered kindness through her child? He nodded softly. "All right, Emily. Lead the way." Emily's face lit up, and she grabbed his hand without hesitation. For the first time in a long while, Richard didn't pull away. The little hand in his felt oddly comforting, reminding him of something he had long forgotten: human touch without expectation. As she led him across the park, Richard noticed how people looked at them, a small girl holding the hand of a man in a tailored suit. Some smiled, some looked curious, but Emily didn't care. She skipped happily, talking about her favorite games, her toys, and how her mommy made the best pancakes in the world. Richard found himself listening, not out of politeness, but because her voice carried a joy that made the heaviness in his chest slightly lighter. When they reached the tree, Emily called out, "Mommy! Mommy! This is my new friend. He looks sad, so I brought him to you." Clara, the woman under the tree, looked up from her book. Her eyes met Richard's, and for a moment, he felt something shift inside him. There was no recognition of his wealth, no flicker of surprise at who he was, only a calm, steady gaze that made him feel seen. She gave a small smile and stood up, brushing the grass off her dress. "Hello," she said politely. "I hope Emily wasn't bothering you." Richard shook his head quickly. "No, not at all. She, actually made my day a little brighter." Clara's smile grew slightly, and Richard felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through him. In that simple exchange, he realized this chance meeting might mean more than he could understand at that moment. And it all began with a little girl who noticed what the world had ignored. Clara stood quietly, her gentle smile resting on her face as she looked at the tall man her daughter had brought over. She could tell he wasn't like most strangers who sometimes passed by in the park. His clothes were neat, a little too formal for such a casual place, and there was something in his eyes that spoke of a deep tiredness. Yet, he had been kind enough to let Emily drag him across the park without complaint. That said something about his nature. Richard, on the other hand, found himself a little nervous. It was unusual for him to feel that way, because in meetings, negotiations, and even public interviews, he was always in control. But standing there in front of Clara, introduced so innocently by Emily, he felt oddly exposed, as if she might be able to see right through the walls he had carefully built around his heart. Clara closed her book and reached her hand forward. "I'm Clara," she said softly. "Thank you for being patient with Emily. She has a habit of making friends with strangers if she feels they need one." Richard shook her hand gently. "I'm Richard," he replied. "And I think, she might be right about me needing a friend." Clara raised an eyebrow, her expression thoughtful. "Well, Emily is usually a good judge of character. If she trusts you, I suppose I can too." Emily, delighted with her success, clapped her hands and sat down on the picnic blanket Clara had spread under the tree. "Mommy, can we share our sandwiches with Mr. Richard? He looks hungry." Richard chuckled softly. "Oh no, I wouldn't want to take your food." But before he could decline properly, Clara nodded. "You're welcome to join us. It's nothing fancy, just some sandwiches and fruit, but Emily loves sharing." For reasons he couldn't fully explain, Richard agreed. He sat down on the edge of the blanket, trying not to crease his suit further, but when Emily handed him a sandwich wrapped in paper, he accepted it with gratitude. The first bite surprised him. It was simple, just bread, cheese, and fresh vegetables, but it tasted better than some of the meals he had eaten in the finest restaurants. Maybe it wasn't the food itself but the company that made it feel comforting. As they ate, Emily filled the air with her stories. She talked about her school, about the cat that sometimes sat on their window, and about how her mommy always read her bedtime stories. Richard listened carefully, occasionally asking small questions, and Clara observed quietly. She noticed how gentle his voice became when speaking to Emily, how patient he was in listening to her endless chatter. It was rare to see strangers give that much attention to a child, and it softened her impression of him. After a while, Clara asked casually, "So, Richard, do you often come to this park?" He hesitated for a moment. Not really. This was, more of an escape today. Escape, she repeated, curiosity flickering in her tone. He gave a small nod. Work can be overwhelming sometimes. I thought a quiet place might help me breathe. Clara studied him, sensing that there was more behind his words, but she didn't press. Instead, she simply said, "Well, you picked a good spot. Nature has a way of reminding us to slow down." Her calm wisdom surprised him. Most people he met spoke in rushed tones, always trying to impress or extract something from him. Clara's words were simple, yet they carried a kind of grounding he hadn't felt in a long time. Emily soon finished her food and began running around the tree, chasing after butterflies. Richard found himself watching her with a faint smile. "She's full of energy," he remarked. Clara laughed softly. "Yes, she is. She keeps me on my toes, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. She's the best part of my life." There was pride in her voice, and it touched something in Richard. He wondered what it would be like to have such unconditional love, to have someone who looked at you the way Emily looked at her mother. For all his wealth, he had never experienced that kind of connection. As the afternoon sun shifted, Richard realized he had been sitting with them far longer than he intended. Normally, he would be rushing to check emails or calling his assistant about schedules. But for once, he didn't care. He felt strangely at peace, as though he had stepped into a world far removed from the one he usually lived in. When it was time for Clara and Emily to head home, Richard found himself reluctant to say goodbye. Emily held his hand once more and looked up at him with her bright eyes. "Will you come to the park again, Mr. Richard?" He smiled gently. "Would you like me to?" "Yes," she said eagerly. "Then you won't be sad anymore." Clara looked at him thoughtfully, waiting for his response. He nodded. "I'll try to come by again." As they walked away, Richard remained seated under the tree, watching them until they disappeared from sight. His chest felt lighter, yet at the same time, a longing grew inside him. He didn't fully understand it, but something about that mother and daughter had touched a place in his heart he thought was long buried. The next day, despite his busy schedule, Richard found himself returning to the park. He told himself it was just for a walk, but deep down, he hoped to see Emily and Clara again. And when he spotted them in their usual spot, his lips curved into a smile before he even realized it. Emily rushed toward him the moment she saw him. "You came back," she shouted with delight. Clara smiled warmly, though her eyes held a hint of surprise. "I didn't think we'd see you so soon." "I guess I liked the company," Richard admitted honestly. Over the following days, Richard became a regular visitor. Sometimes he brought a small treat for Emily, like a book or a chocolate bar. Other times, he simply sat with Clara while Emily played. Slowly, their conversations deepened. They spoke about simple things: weather, food, books, but beneath it all, Richard felt a quiet connection building. Clara never asked about his job or his money. She treated him as just a man sitting under a tree, not a wealthy figure to admire or envy. That was what drew him back again and again. He didn't have to be the CEO in front of her. He could just be Richard. And as days turned into weeks, he realized he wanted more than just afternoons in the park. He wanted to know their world, to understand the life that made Clara so calm and Emily so pure-hearted. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere, not because of what he owned, but because of who he was becoming when he was with them. Richard had never thought that a small park in the middle of the city would become his place of peace. Yet each day, as he sat under the tree with Clara and Emily, he felt more alive than he had in years. It was strange how quickly the pattern formed. He would finish his meetings, shake hands with business partners, smile for cameras if needed, and then, instead of returning to his cold mansion, he would find himself walking toward the park. The anticipation of hearing Emily's laughter and Clara's calm voice pulled him there like a magnet. At first, Richard told himself he was only being kind, that spending time with them was just a break from his stressful life. But deep inside, he knew it was more than that. There was something about this small family that drew him in. Emily's innocence reminded him of the childhood he barely remembered, and Clara's steady warmth made him wonder what it would feel like to truly belong somewhere. He began noticing little things about Clara. The way she tucked Emily's hair behind her ear when it got messy, the way her eyes softened whenever her daughter giggled, and the way she spoke, never rushed, never demanding, just honest and gentle. He wasn't used to that. In his world, people always wanted something from him: deals, favors, investments. But Clara never asked. If anything, she seemed cautious about him, as though she didn't want to assume too much from his presence. One evening, after a long day at work, Richard brought Emily a small storybook he had found at a bookstore. It wasn't expensive compared to the things he usually bought, but it was chosen carefully. When he handed it to her, Emily squealed with delight and immediately opened it, showing the colorful pictures to her mother. Clara smiled, touched by the gesture. "You didn't have to," she said softly. "I wanted to," Richard replied. "She reminds me what joy looks like." Clara looked at him with curiosity, almost as if she wanted to ask more, but she let the silence stretch between them instead. Richard was grateful. He wasn't ready to explain the emptiness of his own life, not yet. As days passed, their bond deepened. Richard found himself laughing more often. Emily would pull him into her games, insisting he play tag or help her build tiny castles with sticks and leaves. At first, he felt awkward, a grown man in a suit crouching in the dirt, but the happiness in Emily's eyes erased his hesitation. Soon, he was chasing butterflies and joining her silly contests, laughing so hard that people passing by stared in surprise. Clara noticed the change too. She had seen men come and go in her life, most of them too busy to truly connect with her daughter. But Richard was different. Despite his polished appearance, he let himself be pulled into Emily's world, and that touched Clara's heart. Still, a part of her remained cautious. She didn't know much about him beyond what he allowed her to see. He never spoke about his work or his personal life in detail. He was a mystery, and though she trusted him with her child in the park, she wasn't sure how much she should let herself trust him beyond that. One afternoon, as the three of them sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emily leaned against Richard and asked, "Mr. Richard, do you have a family?" The question caught him off guard. He froze for a moment before answering carefully. "Not really, Emily. My parents are gone, and I don't have a family of my own." Emily tilted her head, her small face full of innocence. "That's sad. Everybody should have a family. Maybe you can borrow ours." Richard's throat tightened, and he couldn't find words. He simply smiled and patted her hair, though his chest ached in ways he couldn't describe. Clara glanced at him, and in her eyes, he saw understanding. She didn't press him with questions, but he could tell she felt the weight of his silence. That night, when Richard returned to his mansion, the walls seemed colder than ever. He walked through the grand halls, past expensive paintings and furniture, but none of it gave him comfort. All he could think about was the warmth of Clara's smile and the sound of Emily's laughter. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he wasn't just visiting them for company, he needed them. But with that realization came fear. He had spent his whole life building a fortress of success, hiding behind his money and power. Would Clara and Emily still look at him the same way if they knew who he really was? Would they see the man they had grown to trust, or would they only see the millionaire CEO who owned half the city? The fear grew heavier each day. He noticed Clara watching him with quiet curiosity sometimes, as though she sensed there was more to his story. He wanted to tell her the truth, but something held him back. He had experienced enough false friendships to know how quickly people's attitudes could change once his wealth was revealed. What if Clara pulled away? What if Emily no longer saw him as Mr. Richard, her friend, but as someone unreachable? One evening, as they sat under the tree, Clara asked softly, "Richard, what do you do for work?" It was a simple question, an ordinary one. But Richard felt his chest tighten. He could have answered truthfully that he was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, that his face was often in magazines, that people lined up just to get a meeting with him. Instead, he chose a safer reply. "I manage a company," he said vaguely. "It keeps me busy." Clara nodded, though he could tell she wasn't fully convinced. Still, she didn't push. She simply smiled and said, "Well, whatever it is, I hope you don't let it steal all your time. Some things are more important than work." Her words struck him deeply. He knew she was right, but hearing it from her made it even clearer. Work had stolen everything from him: his relationships, his peace, and maybe even his chance at happiness. But with Clara and Emily, he felt he was being given a second chance, a chance to rediscover what mattered. As the weeks passed, Richard found himself caught in a quiet struggle. On one side was the fear of losing them if they discovered the truth, and on the other was the desire to let them fully into his life. Every smile from Clara, every laugh from Emily made the struggle harder. He wanted to be honest, but he wasn't sure if his heart could handle the risk. One night, he lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed with emails and reminders of the business world waiting for him, but he ignored them. Instead, he thought of Emily's little hand in his, of Clara's calm voice telling him to slow down. He realized something he hadn't admitted even to himself: he wasn't just attached to them. He was falling in love with the life they represented. A simple, honest life filled with love, laughter, and belonging. And yet, the fear still lingered. Would Clara ever accept him if she knew the truth? Or would she see him as just another rich man trying to buy happiness? That question stayed with him, heavy and unanswered, as he drifted into uneasy sleep. Richard's secret had begun to weigh on him more than ever. Every time he walked into the park and saw Emily run toward him, every time Clara greeted him with that calm smile, he felt torn. They saw him as an ordinary man, someone kind enough to sit under a tree and listen to their stories. But he wasn't ordinary. He was the man whose name appeared in newspapers, the one people whispered about with admiration or envy. And sooner or later, Clara would discover the truth. He told himself it didn't matter, that maybe she would never ask more, maybe she didn't care who he was outside the park. But deep down, he knew that lies, even small ones, had a way of coming to light. It happened one afternoon, on a day when the park was busier than usual. Richard had arrived earlier than normal, hoping to enjoy a few quiet minutes before Clara and Emily appeared. He sat under the tree, watching families stroll by, when he noticed two men in business suits across the path. They were from his company, junior managers who clearly recognized him. One of them whispered something to the other, and before Richard could stop them, they walked over, their voices filled with the kind of nervous respect he was so used to hearing in offices. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes," one said quickly, nodding his head. "We didn't expect to see you here. Should we update you about the meeting results from this morning?" Richard's face hardened. He glanced around nervously, hoping Clara and Emily weren't nearby. He waved the men away. "Not here. I'm off duty. Please, just go." The men nodded awkwardly and left, but the damage had already been done. When Richard turned his head, he saw Clara standing a short distance away, holding Emily's hand. Her eyes were fixed on him, filled not with anger, but with quiet confusion. He stood quickly, walking toward her. "Clara, I can explain." She held up her hand gently. "So, you're Mr. Hayes? The Richard Hayes?" Her voice was calm, but Richard could hear the shift in it. "Emily, too young to understand, simply looked up curiously, not knowing why the air felt different. "Yes," Richard admitted softly, his heart heavy. "I should have told you earlier. I didn't want to hide, but," he paused, searching for words. "I didn't want you to see me the way everyone else does." Clara's brows furrowed slightly. "And how does everyone else see you?" "As the millionaire CEO," he said bitterly. "As a man with power, money, influence. People look at me and see what I can give them, what they can gain. No one ever looks at me as just a man. Just Richard." Clara didn't respond immediately. She looked down at Emily, who was tugging at her hand, asking in her small voice, "Mommy, what's wrong? Why is Mr. Richard sad again?" Clara bent down, brushing her daughter's hair gently. "Nothing, sweetheart. Mommy just needs a moment." Then she looked back at Richard. "You should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth," she said quietly. "Do you know what hurts the most? Not that you're wealthy or powerful. It's that you thought I might care about those things more than who you are with us." Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to reach out, to explain, but her words cut deeply because they were true. He had been afraid of losing the one honest bond he had, and in trying to protect it, he had built it on half-truths. "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice low. "Afraid that once you knew, things would change. I didn't want to lose what we have." Clara studied him, her eyes softening slightly but still guarded. "And now? What do you expect me to do with this truth?" "I don't expect anything," Richard said quickly. I want you to know that with you and Emily, I've been more myself than I have been in years. No business, no titles, just a man who wants to belong." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Emily, sensing the heaviness, tugged at Richard's sleeve. "Mr. Richard, will you still play with me?" Her innocent voice broke the tension. Clara looked at her daughter, then at Richard. She sighed softly. "Emily loves you. And I can see you care about her too. That means something. But I need time, Richard. Time to understand what all this means." Richard nodded, his heart aching but hopeful. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait." That evening, as Clara and Emily walked away, Richard remained on the bench, staring at the ground. He felt like a man who had just opened his chest and handed over his heart, not knowing whether it would be kept safe or broken. For years, he had controlled every detail of his life, every decision calculated, every risk measured. But with Clara, there was no control, only hope and fear. The days that followed were uncertain. Clara didn't stop meeting him in the park, but she was quieter, more thoughtful. She listened when he spoke, but her smiles were smaller, less frequent. Richard respected her distance, though it hurt. He tried to show her through his actions that he wasn't there to impress or to win her with wealth. He was there because he wanted to be, because being with them filled the emptiness no amount of money ever could. Emily, blissfully unaware of the tension, continued as always. She held Richard's hand, told him her stories, and pulled him into games. Her laughter was a bridge between the distance growing between him and Clara, and Richard held onto it tightly. One afternoon, Clara finally broke the silence. "Richard, do you know why I hesitated when I found out the truth?" He looked at her, his heart pounding. "Because you don't trust me." She shook her head gently. "No. Because I've seen what wealth does to people. It changes how they live, how they love, even how they raise their children. And I've worked so hard to give Emily a simple, honest life. I couldn't bear to see her caught in a world full of glitter but empty of peace." Her words struck him deeply. He nodded slowly. "You're right. Wealth can destroy. It almost destroyed me. But that's why I came to the park that day. I was drowning in it. You and Emily reminded me of something I had forgotten, what real joy feels like. Clara studied him, and for the first time since the truth came out, her expression softened into something warmer. If that's true, then prove it. Not with gifts or promises. Prove it by being consistent, by being real. If you can do that, then maybe I can believe you. Richard felt a surge of determination. I'll do whatever it takes, he promised. Not to earn your approval, but to show you that I mean every word. From that day on, Richard was more careful. He didn't talk about his business, didn't try to impress them. Instead, he focused on small things, showing up when he said he would, listening to Clara's thoughts, playing with Emily without distraction. Slowly, Clara's guarded walls began to lower. She laughed more often, her eyes meeting his with less hesitation. Richard knew the journey wasn't over. Trust wasn't built in a day, especially after the shock of his secret. But each moment spent under that tree, each smile from Clara, each giggle from Emily, was a step closer to the life he secretly longed for, a life where he wasn't Mr. Hayes, the CEO, but simply Richard, the man who found his heart again in the kindness of a little girl's question. Time passed slowly, and with it, Richard began to feel the change in his own heart more clearly than ever. He still carried the weight of his business, the constant demands of being a CEO, the endless meetings and deals, but somehow, those things no longer defined him the way they once did. The highlight of his days was no longer closing contracts or seeing his company's name in the news. It was sitting on the grass, listening to Emily's laughter, or watching Clara's eyes soften when she allowed herself to smile. He had promised Clara he would prove himself not with gifts or grand gestures but with consistency, honesty, and presence. And he kept that promise. Every day he showed up, every day he listened, every day he made it clear through his actions that his heart was not interested in showing off his wealth but in building something real. Slowly, Clara's hesitation began to fade. One evening, the park was quieter than usual. The sun had almost set, and the sky was painted in streaks of gold and purple. Richard sat with Clara while Emily played nearby, trying to catch fireflies in the soft light. Clara broke the silence with a soft voice. You know, Richard, she said, looking at the horizon, I was wrong about something. Richard turned his head toward her, curious. About what? She kept her eyes on the sky. I thought when I found out who you were, everything would change. I thought I would never be able to see you the same way again. But I realize now that Emily was right from the beginning. She saw something I didn't. She saw you as a person, not a title. And slowly, I've started to see that too. Her words touched him more deeply than he could express. He swallowed the lump in his throat, his voice soft. That means more to me than anything else. I don't need the world to see me differently, Clara. I just needed someone, you, to see me for who I am. Clara turned her head, and for the first time, she looked at him with a warmth that carried no doubt. And I do, she said gently. At that moment, Emily ran back to them, her small hands cupped around a firefly glowing faintly in the dim light. Look, Mr. Richard. I caught a star, she said proudly. Richard chuckled, holding out his hand so she could place it gently on his palm. He watched the little light flicker before letting it fly back into the night. That's beautiful, Emily. Just like you. Emily grinned and hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck. It was such a simple gesture, yet for Richard, it was priceless. No amount of money, no success in the world could compare to the feeling of being hugged with such pure love. That night, as Richard walked home, he realized something with complete certainty. He no longer wanted to live in a mansion filled with silence. He wanted laughter, warmth, and the kind of belonging only Clara and Emily gave him. He wanted a family. Weeks passed, and Richard grew even closer to them. He started joining them outside the park too. Clara invited him for dinner one evening, and though the meal was simple, just pasta and vegetables, it felt like the most special dinner of his life. The little apartment was modest, nothing like the grand halls he lived in, but to him, it felt more like home than anywhere else had ever felt. Emily insisted on showing him her drawings, her toys, and even asked him to read her a bedtime story. Richard sat on the edge of her bed, reading from the book he had once gifted her, his voice soft, while Clara watched from the doorway with a smile. In that moment, he realized how much he wanted to be part of this world forever. But he also knew he had to make things right completely. He could not live in two halves anymore, the CEO who ruled a company and the man who longed for family. He needed to bring them together honestly, without fear. One afternoon, Richard invited Clara and Emily to his home. Clara hesitated at first, but finally agreed. When they arrived, Emily's eyes grew wide at the sight of the large mansion. She ran around excitedly, pointing at the chandeliers and the big staircase, while Clara looked around quietly, her expression unreadable. Richard didn't try to impress them with the size or the luxury. Instead, he walked Clara through the house and admitted, "All of this means nothing without someone to share it with. I thought success would bring me happiness, but it only gave me emptiness. Being with you and Emily has shown me what I've been missing. This house feels cold because it doesn't have laughter. It doesn't have love. And I don't want to live like that anymore." Clara looked at him, her eyes soft but cautious. "Richard, are you saying this because you feel lonely, or because you truly want us in your life?" He stepped closer, his voice steady. "Because I truly want you. Not as a distraction, not as a way to fill silence, but as my family. Clara, I want to build a life with you and Emily. Not with money, not with power, just with love and honesty." Clara's eyes glistened with emotion, and for a long moment, she said nothing. Then, Emily tugged at her hand, looking up with her innocent smile. "Mommy, can Mr. Richard stay with us forever?" Clara let out a soft laugh through her tears, and finally, she nodded. "Yes, Emily. I think he can." Richard's heart swelled, relief and joy flooding him all at once. For years, he had thought he had everything, only to realize he had nothing that truly mattered. And now, because of one little girl's simple question, "You look sad, mister, wanna meet my mommy?" his entire world had changed. From that day forward, Richard's life took on a new meaning. He still managed his company, but he no longer let it consume him. He made time for dinners with Clara, for bedtime stories with Emily, for quiet evenings filled with laughter instead of silence. He learned to live not just for success but for love. The man who once sat alone on a park bench, weighed down by loneliness, was no longer the same. He was a man who had been given a second chance at life, all because of the kindness of a child and the trust of a woman who saw beyond his title. Richard had discovered that real wealth was not measured in millions but in moments of love, moments of connection, moments of belonging. And in those moments, he had finally found his true home.